Turn to 1 Samuel chapter 8. We'll get started there in just a couple of minutes, but I want to give you just a little bit of background. I don't know if you remember from a couple of weeks ago, but I told you that Samuel was the last of the judges for Israel. And when I use that term judge in this way, I mean the judge that God would raise up and use him to drive away the oppressor, okay, of Israel. And so Samuel, many people don't recognize this, but Samuel is in fact the last judge. He is a unique character in that he is a prophet, he is a priest, and he is also one of the judges. He is actually, I guess if you want to label it this way, he's the high priest during this period of time. The one responsible for sacrifices. He's a prophet. He hears from God. If you know the story of Samuel when he was a little boy, he lived with a man named Eli, and who was the priest at the time, and he was learning from him. And there's that story of how Samuel heard his name, and he thought it was Eli calling him. And each time he would go, Eli would say, "No, it wasn't me." And then finally Eli says, "Listen, if it keeps happening, it's the Lord who's calling to you, Samuel." And so God spoke to Samuel. And so he was in that unique position of being a prophet, a priest, and a judge. He was dedicated to the Lord before he was born. I mean, he was made for this. I guess you could really kind of call him just a man for every event, or a man for all seasons, however you want to say that, because he was, really unique in that way. But it's because he was dedicated by his mother even before he was born. She was barren, and so she prayed to God and said, "God, if you will just bless me with a child, a son, I will give him back to you." And indeed she did. She gave him back to the Lord, dedicated to the Lord before he was born. He was a man of character and example. We'll see that, as we, if you read the story of Samuel, I'll put it that way, you'll see it. I wish I could spend more time on Samuel this morning, but he's not really our subject, okay? I'd love to spend some time talking about this guy. But if you read about him, you're going to see that he is a man of character and of example. But his sons did not walk in his way. His sons were in line to become the next priests, and that's part of the problem. And so what happens is, because Israel recognizes that his two sons don't act like he does and don't serve like he does, they don't believe as he does, then what happens is they actually begin to cry out for a king. And that brings us to where we are in chapter 8. And so I want to pick up with verse 4 there in chapter 8. It says, when Samuel grew old... Oh, I'm sorry. I started reading from verse 1. Hey, it happens. Kelby, it happens. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old, your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us such as all the other nations have." But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, "Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do." And so Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will do. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your men servants and maidservants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will use for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you in that day. I want to pause there for just a second, because I don't know if you caught the description, but it's like, is he talking about the king, or is he talking about our government? And that's kind of the point. When you give people that kind of power, I mean, really, like we have given to some people in our government, or many in our government, when you give them that kind of power, they become corrupt. That's the point that he's making. They can't, in some ways they can't. I'm not saying everyone does. Please don't hear that. I'm just saying that, in fact, you'll see as we go through, the key thing is if they take their eyes off of God at all, they're going to become like the king, taking advantage of the people. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations. You know, you've heard that before, keeping up with the Joneses. You know, Terry and Pam hate that phrase. Terry and Pam Jones. Some of you didn't get it. Yeah, but keeping up with the Joneses. I mean, we want to be like everyone else. And I mean, isn't that a problem today? We'll be like all the other nations with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles. And when Samuel heard all that the people said, he repeated it before the Lord, and the Lord answered, listen to them and give them a king. Listen to them and give them a king. Then Samuel said to the men of Israel, everyone go back to your own town. Now here's the deal. I started looking at this text, and I told Robbie, I said, you know, the big idea to me in this text is just really one thought. And that thought is following God or following a man of God. Following God or following a man of God. Which one is right? In fact, the question could be asked, is it possible to do both? And I don't know what your answer would be. Is it possible to do both? And some people would jump right on that and say no. And then other people would jump on it and say yes. And I will say that it's possible. And here's why. If you remember what the Apostle Paul said to the people of the churches that he planted, he said to them, follow me as I follow Christ. You know, I've already told you that I learned a lot of things from Bob Edwards. And so in many ways I looked at his example and I tried to mimic that example. I followed Bob in some areas of my life because I knew that the practice that he was, you know, going through, the reason he was doing it was because of God. That it was directed from God to him, and so I could trust that I would be able to follow some of his example. And so is it possible? Yeah, I mean, Paul tells us it's possible. Follow me as I follow Christ. But that man who says that, who uses those words, he better have his eyes on God. Amen? He must have his eyes on God. Otherwise, it is not going to work. So Samuel warns the people, and they still want a king. And here's the deal. Sometimes God gives us what we want. Sometimes he gives us what we want. In fact, if I were to be really bold this morning, most of the time that he gives us what we want, I can almost assure you that it's not what we need. I'm not saying always, but sometimes when he gives us what we want, Garth Brooks used to have a song that was a little bit in reverse. Sometimes I thank God for unanswered prayers. You know? I can look back on my life and say that. I don't know about you, but, you know, and so sometimes God gives us what we want. And that's exactly what he does. He gives them a king. And so there in chapter 9, verses 1 through 3, it says, there was a Benjamite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bekortha, the son of Aphiah of Benjamin. He had a son named Saul, an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others. Many people who've told me or heard me talk about Saul before will recognize this phrase. He was the John Wayne of his day. That was Saul. He stood head and shoulders above everyone else. You know, I can hear Saul saying, "I'm not going to hit you." And then I can't finish the rest of it. Some of you have seen that movie. But he was the John Wayne of his day, or I don't know who we would use today. I'm not much into action movies anymore, but he was the hero of the day. He looked good. And then it says, now the donkeys belonging to Saul's father Kish were lost, and Kish said to his son Saul, "Take one of the servants with you and go look for the donkeys." And I have to admit, when I read this phrase, I thought to myself, if Don Donovan was here, he would be yelling out to me that Saul was a Democrat. He would. Proof being, they own donkeys. And but I don't know if that's the case. But Saul is this impressive young man, and that is, the reason he's introduced here is because God begins to look at Saul. All right, and so following God or following a man of God, how should a king be chosen? How should that model be chosen? How should that example be chosen? Well, I mean, one thing is, if you notice verse 2, men are impressed by appearances. Men are impressed by appearances. They look at the big guy and they're impressed. Terry already read from 1 Samuel 16, verse 7. What's going on there, I'll just tell you, is that God has rejected Saul. We're fast forwarding a little bit. He's rejecting Saul, and he's choosing a new king. And as Samuel is going, and he selects one of the sons of Jesse, because that's where he's directed to go. He selects the first son, who is big and strapping, maybe even a little taller than Saul, maybe even a little broader in the shoulders than Saul, and he sees him and he says, it must be him. And that's when God says to him, Samuel, don't look at the outward appearance. For man does that, but I judge the heart. I look at the heart. I examine the heart. And so he works all his way down through the sons of Jesse to the point that he comes to Jesse saying, well, I don't have any more boys. Oh yeah, wait a second, there's one. He's just a kid, though, and he's out in the pasture taking care of the sheep. I don't know if he should be the king, because this kid he's out there and he plays the harp. He plays the lyre, and he's into music. I'm not so sure he'd be a good king. And Samuel goes out, and God says, this is the anointed one. Anoint him as king of Israel to replace Saul. God doesn't look at the outward appearance. One of the things that happens, you can look good when inwardly you are dead. I have learned to tell a lot in body behavior. And believe it or not, those guys that look so comfortable sometimes, I mean, I'm even talking about, executives. I'm talking about preachers. I'm talking about, or even coaches. I mean, sometimes I've been to the coaching clinic a few years, and I watch guys who seem to be just so comfortable when I know that inside they are so, they could be mixed up. They could be very, maybe have a low self-esteem. You can't judge by outward appearance, because believe it or not, most people who act so calm and cool really aren't. But they try to portray it to other people. How do I know that? Because I'm one of them. I'm one of them. I've told you before that I don't have a great self-esteem. In fact, I have very low self-esteem. But people tell me when I walk into a room, I sure don't look that way. I don't know. maybe part of it's portraying it. Maybe part of it is that God is saying, relax a little bit. I'm the one that's in control, and so I'm able to relax a little bit and let him take control. I don't know, but I can tell you that outwardly I might look really good, but inwardly sometimes it feels like I'm wasting away, and inwardly sometimes I'm scared, and inwardly sometimes I'm angry, or inwardly sometimes I'm sad, and so God says you can look really good on the outside, but inwardly you could be dead. Isn't that what Jesus said to the Pharisees? You're like whitewashed tombs. You look great on the outside, but you step in and you're full of dead man's bones. And so God says, I don't look at the appearances of people. God considers a man's heart, and as I've already covered that verse, he looks at a man's heart. And I want you to understand, before we really get into talking about some of the issues that Saul has, that he actually is very much a humble, capable, and true man at this time. He really is. He's a good man. And so we're introduced to him not simply because the people are going to choose him. How does God know the people are going to choose him? Because that's what they look at. When Saul walks into the picture, God knows that the people are going to say, that's the guy that we want to lead us. God knows it. But God also has examined Saul's heart, and he understands that his heart is pure. His heart is true. All right? So we're going to look at what I call Saul Part 1, okay? We're going to look at Saul Part 1. And it's going to involve some scriptures and some stories. But really, what I would characterize, or how I would characterize Saul at this time, is that he's keeping his eyes fixed on God. Very much keeping his eyes fixed on God. And if you look at 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 18, he's off looking for his father's donkeys, because that's what his father has told him to do. You got to know that he's a good man, or good young man. Why? Because he's doing what his father asked him to do. Right? I mean, isn't one of the commandments for children to obey their parents? I mean, isn't it? It is. All right, so in verse 18, it reads, Saul approached Samuel in the gateway and asked, would you please tell me where the seer's house is? Now let me tell you what's going on here, is that Samuel's with a servant of theirs, and Samuel wants to give up and go home. He said, by now, we're not finding these donkeys, and by now, Dad stopped worrying about the donkeys and probably started worrying about us. And so his friend, the guy that is with him, says to him, well, there's a seer in this next town. Maybe we can go to him and he'll tell us where the donkeys are. Well, the seer ends up being Samuel. All right? They used to use that terminology. The seer was the prophet. And so here in verse 18, he says, would you please tell me where the seer's house is? I am the seer, Samuel replied. Go up ahead of me to the high place. For today you are to eat with me, and in the morning I will let you go and will tell you all that is in your heart. All right? As for the donkeys you lost 3 days ago, don't worry about them. They've been found. I mean, I'm sorry, I got to stop. How freaky would that be? You haven't even asked about it. And yet here he goes, hey, those donkeys, by the way, they've been found. To whom is all the desire of Israel turned, if not to you and all your father's family? Saul answered, but am I not a Benjamite from the smallest tribe of Israel? Didn't I tell you? He's a humble man. And is not my clan in the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why do you say such a thing to me? Then Samuel brought Saul and his servant into the hall and seated them at the head of those who were invited, about 30 in number. Samuel said to the cook, bring the piece of meat I gave you, the one I told you to lay aside. So the cook took up the leg with what was on it and set it in front of Saul. I don't know if you know this or not, but in the Old Testament it teaches that the leg, the part they're talking about, is the thigh. And that the thigh of the meat was always to be presented to the priest, to the high priest. And so what Samuel is doing here is very much It's a blessing he's demonstrating to Saul that he is a special guest. Saul would have recognized that as well. I mean, Saul's probably like, what in the world, because he's being honored in that way. He sets it in front of Saul. Samuel said, "Here is what has been kept for you. Eat because it was set aside for you for this occasion from the time I said, I have invited guests." And Saul dined with Samuel that day. After they came down from the high place to the town, Samuel talked with Saul on the roof of his house. They rose about daybreak, and Samuel called to Saul on the roof, "Get ready, and I will send you on your way." When Saul got ready, he and Samuel went outside together, and as they were going down to the edge of the town, Samuel said to Saul, "Tell the servant to go on ahead of us." And the servant did so. "But you stay here a while so that I may give you a message from God." Now I want to pause again and just tell you, what's happened is after dinner they worshiped. They went up to the high place and they worshiped. They came back down and they spent some time on the rooftop, which was the coolest place in the house, or of the house. So they're on the rooftop and they just spend some time talking. And we don't know what they're talking about. I would imagine that Samuel is sharing with Saul about what God has decided. And then the next morning, as they prepare to go on their way, he sends his servant on ahead of him. And in chapter 10, verse 1, then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him, saying, "Has not the Lord anointed you leader over his inheritance?" And Saul has his eyes fixed on God. How do I know that? Because Saul is not looking at himself. When Samuel says, "You're going to be the king," Saul doesn't go, "Well, that makes sense." He doesn't say, "Well, I thought my resume might impress you." No, he says, "Why are you saying this to me? I am the least. My clan is the least of the tribe, and my tribe is the least of all of Israel." And so, who do you choose? How do you choose that kind of king? You want someone whose eyes are fixed on God, who's someone who says, "I'm not much, but God is powerful. He's incredible. He's awesome, and I'm not much." And so that's kind of the first example. The next example comes in 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 17. So if you want to turn there. It says, Samuel summoned the people of Israel to the Lord at Mizpah and said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought Israel up out of Egypt, and I delivered you from the power of Egypt and all the kingdoms that oppressed you. But you have now rejected your God, who saves you out of all your calamities and distresses. And you have said, 'No, set a king over us.' So now present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and clans." When Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, the tribe of Benjamin was chosen. Probably through casting of lots, we don't know exactly, but basically the tribe of Benjamin is the one that's set out, okay? It's set apart from the rest of them. Then he brought forward the tribe of Benjamin, clan by clan, and Matri's clan was chosen. So that clan that's least of the tribe of Benjamin that Saul said, it's the one that's set aside, set apart. And finally, Saul, son of Kish, was chosen. But when they looked for him, he was not to be found. And so they inquired further of the Lord, "Has the man come here yet?" And the Lord said, "Yes, he's hidden himself among the baggage." He's backstage. They ran and brought him out, and as he stood among the people, he was a head taller than any of the others. And the people were saying, "God, you've made a wonderful choice." Samuel said to all the people, "Do you see the man the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him among all the people." Then the people shouted, "Long live the king." Samuel explained to the people the regulations of the kingship. He wrote them down on a scroll and deposited it before the Lord. Then Samuel dismissed the people, each to his own home. Saul also went to his home in Gibeah, accompanied by valiant men whose hearts God had touched. But some troublemakers said, "How can this fellow save us?" They despised him and brought him no gifts, but Saul kept silent. There's always a few. You know what their names are? Some of them. Man, we get that here still, don't we, Robbie? Is Brian in here too? Well, Brian's gone. We get that here. People come, some of them are saying, Some of them are saying it's too loud. Some of them are saying you can't see the words really well. Some of them are saying they think we ought to do more hymns. There's always some of them. And we see it here, you know. It reminds me of the stories that I've been told about elections years ago at Old Union. There was one particular guy who always voted no because he never wanted anybody to go 100% through. Yeah? Man, you guys are tough this morning. That's funny to me. I mean, funny in a really peculiar way because I don't understand that kind of thing. But some people just are going to complain. And I mean, hang on to that because it's important. All right? And so, again, he's demonstrating humility. It's not fear that he's hiding in the baggage. It's because he just doesn't look at himself as being significant. He doesn't look at himself as being qualified. And then look at chapter 11, verses 12 through 15. We're not going to read that yet. I want to tell you what happens. So Saul is made king. He is made king by God and by the people. And everybody goes back home. Well, there's this particular city, and the city is Jabesh. And Jabesh is under siege by the Ammonites. Nahash the Ammonite, the king of the Ammonites, has laid siege to the city of Jabesh. And so Jabesh says, hey, we will be subject to you we will be subject to you, so don't do us any harm. So Nahash, this king, he says to the people of Jabesh, we'll do that, but you must allow us to gouge the right eye out of every person. In other words, we'll do that. We'll make a treaty with you, but we're going to make you an example so that when people see you, they will know that you are under us. Well, Jabesh says, give us 7 days to make this decision, and then we'll let you know what our decision is. Well, during that 7 days, word gets to Saul, and it says that Saul is ticked. All right? You know, here's a great example. Someone has asked before, and I grew up in a church that said, that basically said, do not be angry. But that's not what the Scripture says. It says, do not sin. Be angry, but do not sin. And so here's a great example of when it's okay to be angry. And Saul is upset. And so he calls, the way that he calls the people of Israel, it's a strange way that he does this, but he takes an oxen and he butchers it and he cuts it into pieces and he sends a piece of it to each one of the 12 tribes. And what they know then is that they're going to war. And so people come and they gather, and Saul, with the men of Israel, rescues the city of Jabesh. All right? I mean, great story, right? That he's come in. First thing he has to do as king is step in and protect the city. And he is successful at it. He's successful. So now look at verse 12. So the people then said to Samuel, who was it that asked, shall Saul reign over us? Bring those men to us, and we will put them to death. So what they're saying is, who's some of them? Tell us who some of them are, and we're going to kill them. Because, first of all, they're idiots. He just displayed he's the right choice. And so they don't know what they're talking about. So bring them out here and we'll just kill them. Now here, you want to see the nature, the character of a man of God? It comes up. But Saul said, no one shall be put to death today. For this day the Lord has rescued Israel. Man, you talk about a built-in example. A few weeks ago, Jeff Lane preached on Wednesday night from Micah 6:8, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Right there. No one's going to die today. For this day the Lord has rescued Israel, a man who loves mercy. Then Samuel said to the people, come, let us go to Gilgal, and there reaffirm the kingship. So all the people went to Gilgal and confirmed Saul as king in the presence of the Lord. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord. Saul and all the Israelites held a great celebration. That's what I call Saul part 1. He begins well. If you know the story of Saul, that's the whole point. Here's a leader who begins well. He's walking with God. He's keeping his eyes on God. But what happens is part 2 comes along and he takes his eyes off of God. He takes his eyes off of God. And one of the first things that you have to be careful with whenever you have your eyes on God, and you have to be careful with success. Let me repeat that. you must be careful with success. And what I'm going to do is just tell the story, if you don't mind. It kind of speeds it up a little bit. In the story, Saul has been, they're going into battle against the Philistines. And so what Samuel says is, all right, God is guaranteed that he's going to be with you. But what you have to do is wait 7 days. Wait for me to come. I will come and I will make a sacrifice in honoring God, and he will lead us into battle. And so Saul is waiting. He's got several troops with him. And as they wait over this period of 7 days, the troops begin to get a little fearful, They get a little scared. I remember when I was coaching, we were over at Tri-Valley. And the varsity was finishing up. We were there on a Thursday night, which is freshman team was there. I had a bunch of freshmen. We had lost the first 2 games, and we had won the next few. And no, that's not true. We were actually undefeated at the time. That was the second year I was coaching, and so we were undefeated, and they were undefeated, and as we were passing by, the coach just happened to say, "Freshmen, you got that game tonight. I expect you to roll over them and be out of here early so you can get home and rest." And we get over, and we're starting to warm up, and I had 2 or 3 kids going, "Coach, did you hear what they said?" I said, "Yeah, I heard what they said." And so, long story short, we beat them. And as we were walking past, the coach was out talking to the kids, and as we're walking past with the team, I said, "Boys, they were 4-0, but now they're 4-1." We kind of got the last laugh with it. But here's the deal. I mean, they start to look around them. They hear things, and they begin to get nervous, just like some of the kids did that night. They begin to get a little bit nervous, and so troops began to scatter away. They began to run away. And Samuel, or Saul, is watching this. And he's the leader, and instead of pulling them together, say, "Listen, Samuel's going to be here. God's on our side. Listen, we're going to be okay with this." Instead of doing that, he gets nervous, and he says, "Well, it is kind of about me anyway, because I'm the leader. Didn't I rescue Jabesh? And everything's been going really well. And so, you know what? I've watched Samuel make a sacrifice before, so I'll just do it." And that's what he goes out and he does. Saul, the king, offers a sacrifice. Now, I told you that Samuel's a unique character, prophet, priest, and king. He can do that kind of thing. Saul can't. He has a role to play, and he ought to stay in his role. But he doesn't. And it's probably because he's been successful, and he's confident, and he's proud, and he walks out there, and he says, "I can do this," and he does it. And at that moment, as he's finishing up, Samuel shows up, and Samuel says, "What are you doing?" Well, I thought, that's the problem, he thought. Instead of being obedient. And he began to take his eyes off of God, place his eyes upon himself. He also made a rash decision in one of the battles against the Philistines. And he said, in his rashness, he said, "No soldier will eat today anything. And if anyone eats anything before we whip these guys, then they must die." Well, the problem was Jonathan, his son, didn't hear that. And so they enter into a woods that's dripping. It says it's dripping with honey. I don't know about you. I'd be uncomfortable in that woods. But it's dripping with honey. And so Jonathan eats some honey, and it energizes him. And Jonathan leads his part of troops to his part of the troops to victory. And afterwards, God is not pleased. Why? Because Saul has made a rash decision, and he calls out his son, finally. He calls out his son, and he says to his son, "What did you do?" And he said, "I just tasted some honey. Now, I got to die for that?" And Saul says, "Yeah, you do." And I'm not sure how this works out. God's will, whatever. But Saul is going to kill Jonathan, but the men step up and say, "Look, you were the stupid one. You were the one who made the rash decision. Jonathan is not dying today." And again, I don't know how God reconciled all that. It doesn't really tell us that. But he makes this rash decision. Why? Because he's not dependent upon what God thinks anymore. He's only responding to what he thinks. And he's making these split-second decisions, and they're wrong. Well, then finally, taking your eyes off of God. You can't overrule God. God tells him that he is to go against, I believe it's the Amalekites. I'll look for that, but I think it's the Amalekites. Yeah. And I think Agag is their king. And so he is told to go and take these men with you and destroy the Amalekites, kill everything that's there, destroy even the sheep and the bulls and everything, destroy all the livestock, even if it looks good, destroy it. Well, he doesn't. He goes and he sees that they've got some really nice sheep. He sees that they've got some really nice cattle. And so he brings it back with him. And he even takes the king and brings him back, kind of as a trophy. And so Samuel hears about it from the Lord, and he comes and he meets Saul. And Saul comes out and says, "Blessings upon you, brother." I mean, Saul's happy. And listen, sometimes, can I tell you something? Sometimes you might be happy, and it might look like God's blessing is upon you, but all that is that in your mind and the stuff that you have around us is you're happy. You might not actually be listening to what he wants, but you feel happy. Well, it's kind of like what we sang about this morning. I can sing when I lose my step. I can sing in the tough times. I can... just understand that Saul comes out and he thinks that he's happy. He thinks that everything's good. And Samuel looks at him and goes, "But you didn't do what God told you to do." He goes, "Yes, I did." And then Samuel says these words, famous, "Then what is the bleating of sheep that I hear?" Oh, that. Yeah, that's the guys did that. I told them not to, but the guys saw them, and they said, "No, we got to take them back. They're too good sheep to kill." And I even brought the king back. God will be pleased about that. Well, and he's not. And so go to the end of that passage, verse 23 in chapter 15. Or verse 22. It says, Samuel replied, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams." And that's what I call Saul part 2, because he's taking his eyes off of God. Now, what about you? What about you? Are you able to say, "Follow me as I follow Christ"? And here's what you're going, "What? What do you mean me?" Because, here's the thing. You were thinking that I was just talking about leaders in the church, weren't you? You were thinking this is okay. This is an okay sermon as long as it's about Miles and the elders and the staff. But this is about you. It's about us. Because here's what I know. There's always someone watching you. There's always someone watching you. So what example are you setting forth? What example do you set? I used to say this at Old Union. You're setting an example. It's either a good one or a bad one. Amen? I mean, that's the truth. For your children, you're setting either a good example or a bad example. We set the example. What kind of example are you setting? Do you set your eyes on Christ, or are you following the pattern of the world around you? Do you see our God as the giver of blessings? Do you realize that there's nothing that you have that He doesn't allow you to have? Do you realize that there's nothing that you have that He has allowed you to have, that someday it's all going to be gone anyway? Man, there's a lot of people that don't. Are your eyes set on Him? Are you using your things in the way that God desires you to use that stuff? Let me ask you this. Do you see Him as the source of your success, or did you do that all by yourself? You know, that's part of what Robbie and I were talking about in this message. We had, in fact, yesterday I came in and I'd gone an entirely different way, and I had shared with him as he was preparing the questions. And I came in yesterday morning, and it just started coming to me this way, and I'm putting it in PowerPoint this way. And so we had a discussion, and this is what I said, because he said that, you know, what I see in this text is that some people don't always realize that God is behind everything. I said, you know what, you're absolutely right. In fact, I know that. See, that's why I don't sweat it too much. I can come to Saturday and not really like what I've prepared, because I know what God is going to do on Saturday, or sometimes even Sunday morning, that God is going to step in and he goes, now you're ready to listen to me, and this is what I want you to do. Are you at that place where you understand that the only reason you have any sort of success is because of him? He is the source of our strength and our power. He is the one who succeeds. We are just simply instruments in his hands. Amen? All right, so now, some excellent advice in this text. I love this passage. To obey is better than sacrifice. I would much rather be obedient to him and not have to come back and offer a sin sacrifice, right? Wouldn't you? I would much rather for him to look at me and say, man, you did really well. I know it was tough. I know it was tough to close your mouth in that moment, but you did well, Miles. Instead of having to come to him and hit my knees and say, Lord, I know I probably just blew that opportunity for that person forever. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams.